Somewhere out on a two-lane highway in the American desert, there is a sign still standing. The neon tubes have gone dark now, most of them, and the plastic letters have faded from red to the color of old salmon. But if you squint, if you let the late afternoon sun hit it just right, you can still read the word, vacancy. And underneath it, in that particular swooping script that belongs to no alphabet ever taught in school, a name. The starlight. The sundowner. The blue moon. The desert rose. And beneath the sign, set back from the road just enough to feel intentional, a low-slung building with a roofline that juts forward at an impossible angle, as if the whole structure is leaning toward the highway, reaching for you, trying to pull you in off the asphalt before you make it another 10 miles to the competition. That building is talking to you. It always was. And today, we're going to learn what it was saying. The story of the mid-century American motel is really a story about speed. Not the speed of the automobile itself, though that matters deeply, but the speed of decision-making that the automobile made necessary. Before the car, a traveler arrived by train. The station was fixed. The hotel was nearby. You walked, you checked in, you had time. But the automobile changed everything about that equation. Now the traveler was moving at 50, 60 miles an hour past a corridor of competing businesses, and every one of those businesses had roughly 3 to 5 seconds to communicate its entire value proposition before the car was gone and the opportunity was lost forever. 3 to 5 seconds. That is the design problem that produced the American roadside aesthetic, and it is one of the most creative and underappreciated challenges in the history of commercial architecture. The solution had a name, though it wasn't given that name until decades later. Architects and historians would eventually call it Googie, after a coffee shop in Los Angeles designed by John Lautner in 1949. The term stuck, even if the style itself had been evolving organically up and down the American highway system since the early post-war years. Googie architecture was not a school of thought in any formal sense. It was a survival strategy. It was what happened when builders and owners and sometimes self-taught designers tried to answer the same question over and over again: how do you make someone slam on the brakes? The cantilevered roof was one answer. Picture it. A roofline that extends dramatically outward beyond the walls that support it, defying your instinctive understanding of how weight and gravity are supposed to work. These weren't just decorative gestures. They were statements. They said, this building is modern. This building is from the future. This building understands physics better than the one down the road. In the years right after World War II, the word modern carried enormous emotional weight for the American middle class. The men coming home from the Pacific and from Europe had seen devastation on a scale that most Americans at home couldn't fathom, and what they wanted, what they had earned, was newness. Clean lines. Forward momentum. A country that was going somewhere rather than looking back. The cantilevered roof, the starburst ornament, the boomerang-shaped swimming pool, these weren't frivolities. They were promises. There was something else happening in those rooflines, too, something that borrowed directly from the visual language of the space age that was just beginning to announce itself to American culture. By the mid-1950s, the idea of rockets and trajectories and the conquest of the sky was everywhere, in comic books, in television programs, in the tail fins of Cadillacs and the nose cones of Chevrolets. The motel architects absorbed all of this and fed it back to the highway traveler in the form of structures that seemed to aim themselves at the horizon, that seemed ready to launch. A roofline angled like a ski jump. A lobby ceiling that swept upward into a dramatic peak. Walls of glass that dissolved the boundary between interior and exterior, suggesting a transparency, an openness, a modernity that the old roadside inn or the downtown hotel simply could not offer. And then there was the neon. You have to understand what neon meant before you can understand what it did. Neon lighting had existed since the early 20th century, but by the post-war years it had become so refined, so versatile, so comparatively affordable, that it was transformed into a genuine artistic medium for commercial communication. A skilled neon bender, and that is precisely what they were called, the craftsmen who shaped the glass tubes, could produce almost any letter form, any shape, any color in the spectrum from warm orange-red through cool blue-white and everything in between. The tubes could be twisted into script that looked handwritten, stretched into block letters that could be read from a quarter mile away, arranged into pictograms of cocktail glasses and swimming pools and arrows pointing down at the very building you were supposed to be noticing. The typography of neon signs deserves its own meditation because it developed according to rules that had almost nothing to do with the rules of print typography. A neon letter had to be bent from a single continuous tube wherever possible, which meant certain letter forms were preferred and others were avoided. It had to glow evenly, which meant that tight curves and sharp angles were engineering challenges as much as aesthetic choices. and it had to be legible from a moving vehicle, which meant that the contrast between the illuminated tube and the dark night sky was everything. The designers of these signs, most of them operating without any formal design education, understood instinctively what the Swiss typographers and Bauhaus masters understood theoretically, that legibility is a function of contrast, that the eye reads shape before it reads detail, that the first fraction of a second of perception determines whether a sign registers at all. The color choices were not arbitrary either. Red neon, which is actually produced by pure neon gas, reads as warmth, as heat, as urgency. Blue and green, which require mercury vapor and sometimes argon, read as coolness, as modernity, as a certain technological sophistication. The motels that wanted to signal affordable friendliness leaned toward the reds and oranges. The ones trying to suggest a slightly more upscale experience reached for blues and whites. And the ones that wanted to stop every car on the highway regardless of what they were selling combined them in compositions that were sometimes gaudy, sometimes inspired, and almost always unforgettable. What was being sold, underneath all this visual language, was a very specific promise to a very specific customer. The mobile middle class of post-war America was a new phenomenon in world history. These were families who owned cars, who took vacations, who had enough disposable income to sleep somewhere other than a relative's spare bedroom when they drove from Ohio to Florida or from Kansas to California. They were not wealthy. They could not afford the Grande Dame downtown hotels with their marble lobbies and their uniformed bellmen. But they had expectations. They had seen enough of the old roadside cabin courts, the ones with the bare bulbs and the thin walls and the smell of mildew that no amount of pine sol could fully address, and they wanted something better. They wanted to feel, if only for one night on the way to somewhere else, that they were modern people living in a modern country, that America had delivered on its post-war promises. The well-designed motel of the 1950s and early 1960s answered that need with extraordinary precision. The neon sign said, "We are open, we are here, we are worth your attention." The cantilevered roof said, "We are modern, we are forward-looking, we have not been left behind by the future." The swimming pool, even if it was only 12 feet across and 4 feet deep, said, "This is a luxury, you have earned a luxury, you are on vacation and vacation is a legitimate and wonderful thing for an American family to take." The room itself, with its wall-to-wall carpet and its built-in television and its individually controlled air conditioning unit humming beneath the window, said everything that needed to be said about the distance traveled from the Depression, from the war, from the years of rationing and sacrifice and doing without. There is a word that architectural historians sometimes use for buildings that communicate meaning through their form, and that word is semiotic. It just means that the building is a sign as much as it is a structure, that its shapes and materials and proportions are a language that literate viewers can read. By that definition, the mid-century roadside motel was one of the most eloquently semiotic buildings in American history, because its intended audience was reading it at 50 miles an hour with no particular intention of slowing down, and yet the building spoke loudly enough to be heard. The tragedy, if there is one, is that the language eventually stopped being legible. By the late 1960s and certainly by the 1970s, the major chains had arrived with their standardized construction, their focus group color palettes, their signs designed by corporate committees rather than individual sign painters and neon benders. The independent motel, the one with the personal name and the hand-painted arrow and the neon swimmer perpetually diving into a blue tube of light, found itself in competition with something it could not match on price or on amenities. One by one the starlights and the sundowners and the blue moons went dark, or were absorbed, or were torn down to make room for a franchise property that looked exactly like every other franchise property on every other highway in every other state in the Union. What we lost in that transition was not merely a visual style. What we lost was a particular kind of optimism, a belief that the future was worth announcing, worth celebrating, worth bending glass tubes by hand to declare. The Googie architects and the neon sign makers were not nostalgics. They were not preservationists. They were people who believed so completely in the forward motion of American life that they built that belief into the very rooflines of their buildings and the very curves of their letters. They believed that a family in a station wagon, passing through the desert at dusk, deserved to see something beautiful and strange and promising waiting for them on the horizon. And some nights, when the light is right and the old signs haven't entirely given up, you can still see exactly what they meant.